approved in its first reading a boycott law which would levy harsh punitive fines on Israelis who call for academic or economic boycotts against Israeli institutions. The draft law also calls for imposing sanctions against foreign nationals and organizations that call for anti-Israel boycotts, as well as against states that pass legislation giving such boycotts force of law. This is quoting one of the legislators. This is an important and reasonable bill that will enable us to continue to ask the U.S. to take legal action against citizens who boycott Israel. So the target is not just Israelis, but to reach to the United States and presumably Canada as well to stop us from talking about this. Foreign citizens who violate the law could be prohibited from entering Israel for 10 years or more. Now, so what does this add up to? The Israeli response to boycott, divestment, and sanctions is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I can't think of a clearer endorsement of the tactic than that. The difference is, when we support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, it is in order to end a system of racial discrimination and apartheid, whereas they want to use it to preserve a system of racial discrimination and apartheid. The ends matter, even if the tactics sound the same. I think, and I'd like to echo Valerie's comments in her introduction, that there's no reason to believe this can't be done. We are used to thinking of justice in Palestine, of freedom for the Palestinians, as something that is distant, that's far away. And I think we have to change the way we think about it. We have to start thinking about something that is within our reach within the next few years. And we have to step up our mobilization and our engagement with that in mind. Everything points to this being possible. Not inevitable, but within our reach. For many years now, I've seen a trend that, again, I write about, where Israel is at an ideological dead end. There's nowhere else to go. Israel operates a de facto. My book talks about a one-state solution. When it came out a few years ago, people said that's crazy. Just the other day, Netanyahu was publicly speaking about a one-state solution and the danger of a one-state solution. But we have to recognize that Israel already has the de facto policy of successive Israeli governments is a one-state solution from the river to the sea. How can we interpret it any other way? Since the so-called peace process began almost 20 years ago, Israel has continued to confiscate Palestinian land, build settlements, almost tripling, more than doubling, almost tripling the number of settlers in the West Bank and around Jerusalem in the past 20 years, and doing everything possible to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, the emergence of a two-state solution. Even now, when, we have more and more countries recognizing a Palestinian state. I don't believe in these gimmicks. I think that this is a gimmick that is a substitute. Some countries may do it sincerely, but I think when the UK or the United States raise the status of the Palestinian diplomatic mission in their capitals, it's a cynical gesture. It's like recognizing the Bantustans. But my point is that even these empty gestures of recognizing a non-existent Palestinian state, Israel objects to. So where is this two-state solution? It's not there. Israel has a de facto one-state solution. But it's an apartheid state. And it's not an apartheid state that is content with the status quo. It is an apartheid state that continues to push the Palestinians out of Jerusalem, out of the Nakba, the Negev, trying to take over the Galilee. It's a one-state solution that doesn't rest, that continues to impose laws that would be considered horrifying in any other democracy. Loyalty oaths. You have something called the I think it's called the Admissions Committee Bill, which is a law that allows communities in Israel to decide who can live in them. It's clearly understood in Israel that this is a means to to allow Jewish towns from it's a means to allow Jewish towns to prevent Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, from moving into them. And this is becoming a big problem for Jewish towns because since 1948, Israel has prohibited the construction of a single new town for its Arab population. You have to think about this. In 1948, 90% of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the area that became Israel. About 150,000 Palestinians were left. Today their numbers have grown to about almost 1.5 million. This is just within the pre-1967 borders of Israel. It would be good to have a map. I'm sorry I didn't think of putting one up. But the point is that you have, just dealing with the Palestinians inside Israel who have Israeli citizenship, their numbers have grown about tenfold since Israel was founded, and the number of new towns and developments Israel has allowed them to build is zero. Zero. So there's a need to move into places where housing is available. And as Palestinians move to places where there's housing, which is predominantly Jewish towns, we see this reaction of laws passed to prevent this from happening. In Canada, in the United States, you have equal housing laws. In Israel, they're passing unequal housing laws. In 2011, you have recently, a few months ago, in December, 300 rabbis, municipal rabbis, whose salaries are paid by the State of Israel, issued a decree banning Jews from renting or selling property to Arabs. These are not crackpot rabbis in the West Bank. They are 300 municipal rabbis whose salaries are paid by the state. Yesterday, another news item. Rabbi Israel Rosen called for a boycott. So boycott is okay sometimes. I hereby call for a boycott of I'll just read the introduction. Rabbi Israel Rosen, head of the Somet Institute, dedicated to merging halachic Judaism with modern life, has launched a scathing attack on a Knesset member of the Independence faction over her marriage to a non-Jewish man. He made his statement following reports that Wilf, her name is Einat Wilf, would be appointed chairwoman of the Knesset's Education Committee. I hereby call for a boycott of all of her public activities in these fields as a clear negative character, being married to a German who is not Jewish, and I believe hasn't acquired citizenship either. The rabbi wrote in an article published in a Shabbat leaflet. The 300 municipal rabbis had also called for a boycott of any Jew who does business or rents or sells to an Arab. This is in 2011. So I think that when Israel has reached this point of a de facto one-state solution with increasing racism, racists gone wild, there is nowhere to go. As Valerie mentioned, the only tools that are at Israel's disposal to try to maintain this setup is increasing repression. And that manifests in a number of ways. Massacres, as we saw in Gaza in 2008, which was not about rockets. If someone wants to ask me about that in the Q&A in a few minutes, we can talk about that. The real reason was to try to eliminate any remains of resistance in Gaza. Through repression of Palestinian citizens, through the regular tear gassing and beating and shooting of Palestinians and solidarity activists, including Israelis, who protest against Israel's land confiscations in the West Bank, and through the attempt to silence debate, discussion, and action in North America and other countries. I think that Israel is very vulnerable now because of this. The BBC World Service published a poll a few days ago. I had to dig to find, I was immediately, I think it was South Africa, Brazil, and Germany. It's not Canada. I blame Margaret Atwood, Stephen Harper, and Michael Ignatieff. But they didn't mention who was at the bottom of the poll, and that immediately got me suspicious. I thought, oh, Israel's got to be at the bottom because they didn't mention it. BBC is scared to death now of mentioning Israel negatively, even if it's the truth. So when I went and dug out the report, something stunning. It says, Israel remains one of the world's most negatively viewed countries, alongside Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. This was just published yesterday. According to the latest annual survey of global opinion by the BBC World Service. But most significantly, that introduction I wrote, but based on the BBC report. But most significantly, according to the full results of the survey, and I quote, while overall views of Israel have not moved substantially over the past year, there have been significant increases in negative views of the country among Americans, rising from 31% to 41%, and Britons from 50% to 66%. This is stunning, and it's a crisis for Israel. And look what's happening. You have, just the other day, a veteran Israeli diplomat, Ilan Baruch, quits and says he can no longer represent the government. I quote from him. He wrote a letter to all foreign ministry employees when he quit to explain his motives. He said, identifying the objection expressed by global public opinion to the occupation policy as anti-Semitic is simplistic, provincial, and artificial. Experience shows that this global trend won't change until we normalize our relations with the Palestinians. In other words, you have an Israeli diplomat resigning and taking a shot at the kind of silly arguments being pushed by Michael Ignatieff. The good people who organized Israeli Apartheid Week all over Canada and all over the world are anti-Semites and intolerant and anti-freedom, when they know better, and I think the rest of the world is starting to know better as well. So, what are they left with? They're left with that kind of slander and libel, and they're left with increasingly shrill racial and Islamophobic arguments. And that has been the mainstay of pro-Israel activism over the past decade, particularly since September 11th, 2001. We Israelis are the vanguard of Western civilization and democracy amid, a region of savages and barbarians. Well, who asked you to go there in the first place? But you're there, fine, okay. Now, that has involved, particularly in the United States, and I think this has also happened in Canada, a shift in the base of support for Israel away from a traditional, liberal, somewhat progressive base in the 1960s and 70s towards the increasingly extreme